Welcome to the Franklin Institute. My name is Karen Elinich, and I am the Director of Science Content here at the Institute, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our program this evening. Tonight's event is the result of a great partnership between the Franklin Institute and Maker Meetup. It's also a part of the Institute's innovative, high-profile speaker series, through which we take a look at cutting-edge modern science and tackle some of today's biggest questions in the hopes of bringing us all that much closer to the answers. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment of your time to highlight a couple of exhibits that are happening here at the Institute this fall, one of which I think will be of particular interest. It just opened last Saturday, and it's called 3D Printing the Future. It's a small exhibition that engages visitors with the additive manufacturing industry and the amazing technology that is enabling us to print our dreams. It's upstairs on the 3rd floor, and I believe it'll be open this evening after the program if you're interested in stopping by. Otherwise, come back another time this fall, and I'm sure you'll be amazed at and inspired by some of the objects on display. Later this month, the Franklin Institute will be opening an exhibition called Terracotta Warriors of the First Emperor. It opens September 30th and runs through March 4th. It features 170 artifacts from the pre-Qin, Qin, and Han dynasties. In particular, the stars of the show are 10 full-size warriors from the underground mausoleum complex located in Xi'an, China, near the tomb of the first emperor of China. They are truly remarkable artifacts to see in person, truly breathtaking, and such a spectacular story to see these pottery sculptures that are over 2,000 years old on display here in Philadelphia for the first time in over 30 years. The exhibition also features a look at the science and technology involved in the production and the recovery of those artifacts. And so we think visitors will be really excited. We developed this exhibit in-house, and it's truly, we're all very much excited to open it on September 30th so that visitors will have a chance to see what we're so excited about. And now, at this point, I also want to mention our next speaker series, which will be happening on October 19th. Dr. Jayatri Das will be hosting a look at gun violence, the public health perspective, with Dr. Susan Sorensen. And as I mentioned, Thursday, October 19th. Check our website for more details. With that, let's move on to this evening's conversation. And it's my pleasure to welcome Marvin Weinberger, the founder of Maker Meetup.
Thank you and good evening, and welcome to the Makers Meetup, Philadelphia. It's a pleasure to be partnering with the Franklin Institute this evening to bring you this program, along with the 5,200 members of the Philadelphia New Tech Meetup, headed by my longtime friend, Mike Krupitz. I'd like to thank Lee Wellington of the Urban Manufacturing Alliance, who introduced me to Dale, and of course, Kat Abudara and Jerry Trusky of the Franklin Institute, without whom all this couldn't have come together. They are just amazing organizers, and thank you so much to them. I'd like to thank the organizations which participated in our showcase. I hope everyone here had a chance to visit these great entrepreneurs. I understand that the showcase will be open afterwards as well. I hope you are as honored and pleased by what these folks represent as I am. They are great makers and do Philadelphia proud. I'd also like to thank the many volunteers, some of whom are wearing badges, of the Makers Meetup. If you have questions, please seek them out. In particular, I want to thank Bria DeVoe, the co-organizer for the Maker Meetup and for this evening's program. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors, NextFab, Dwayne Morris, Gregory FCA, the Merchants Fund, Ben Franklin Tech Partners, DVIRC, and our prime sponsor, Aero Electronics. Our next program is October 17th at the University Science Center. Free beer and pizza, if you're old enough. Pizza anyway, but soft drinks if not, it's on the honor system. We're featuring the new cohort accepted into the Next Fab Rapid Hardware Accelerator. In fact, there was an article about this fantastic new accelerator at Next Fab in today's Philadelphia Inquirer. On December 5th, we have a program featuring top researchers from NASA, their Innovative Advanced Concepts program. They'll be discussing the absolute leading-edge technologies in space exploration. Perhaps Dr. Pitts will join us for that event as well. We are calling the program Not Quite Science Fiction. I set aside time each week as a volunteer mentor, one of many volunteer mentors in our meetup. If you are an aspiring maker entrepreneur and looking for an independent perspective, please feel to reach out. The coffee is on me. Thank you again for coming.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our program tonight. My name is Derrick Pitts. I'm the Chief Astronomer and Planetarium Programs Director here at Franklin Institute. It really is a distinct pleasure for me to be here tonight to have a great conversation with our speaker. I've been looking forward to this opportunity, as I'm sure many of you have. First of all, my hat's off to all of those great projects that are in the showcase outside. They are really fabulous. Can we just give a big round of applause for everybody who participated in that tonight? There are some really extraordinary projects out there, and it's great to see them all. And I just love to think about the ideas that are flowing all over the region that might manifest themselves someday in a showcase, in a more expanded showcase in which we can see more ideas like that. It's really exciting. So our program this evening is that our speaker is going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about his work and what he's been doing and the ideas behind it all, and then we're going to sit and have a short conversation. But we're also asking the audience to prepare questions to be asked, if you will. And we have a couple of slides, I think, that we might show that will give you the website to which you can send your questions or the Twitter address to which you can send your questions. Let me see if we'll see if we can get that up for you so you can see that. But we'll ask you please to send your questions there. Your questions will come up to me via the tablet here, and I'll be able to run through them, so I'll moderate the Q&A. But we're very much interested in having you participate in this as well. So first we'll do the presentation part. The speaker and I will chat for a few minutes, and then we'll invite you to join in the conversation as well. So time for the introduction. You know, the idea of DIY, of course, has been around for forever, I guess we could say. I remember that as I was growing up, there's certainly what we call DIY, do-it-yourself. The way I remember this is that people knew how to build, they knew how to make things, they knew how to fix things, a lot of which came out of necessity to do so. And they had skill sets that were used in everyday life. And I remember that there were curriculum in schools at that time in which students could learn vocational job training that, of course, went on to support those DIY concepts and ways in which people did things. I remember the vocational track at school when I was a junior high school student, and in many ways was envious of those students that took those programs, you know. And when I was in school, there was an academic track, and there was the vocational track. And I ended up in the academic track, but always wished I had spent more time doing some of the shop classes. I remember them well. They were a lot of fun. Nowadays, when we think of DIY, we think about the weekend home improvement warriors. Redo that bathroom, redo that kitchen, turn the basement into a man cave, turn that mess in the backyard into an English garden by Monday kind of thing. But as described by Britt Morin of Huffington Post, these days, DIY is any activity that uses an element of creative skills to make or design something on your own. That's an interesting description of modern DIY. But there's this newly emerging movement, though, that's something different in a modern DIY. It's the maker movement. what I'll take, and I'm going to take the liberty to describe this. I am going to take the liberty, I hope you don't mind if I take the liberty to describe this, as an intersection of digital social networking, the audacity of the hacker culture to deconstruct highly institutionalized, monolithic function and application, and most importantly, deconstruct highly institutionalized, monolithic digital realms to learn and understand their operation, function, and application. I can't even read my own typing. And most importantly, the desire of people to create whatever is of interest. Not necessarily to create to solve a problem, but often just as an expression of creativity. So I think it's a very interesting movement in DIY that reaches out to a lot of people. Our speaker this evening knows quite a bit about the Maker Revolution. He is Dale Dougherty, CEO of Maker Magazine, but more significantly, he's the founder of Make Magazine, Maker Faire, and he's helped to found the Maker movement itself. These ideas about a maker culture grew out of Dale's work as an author and publisher back in the late 1980s and 1990s of how-to guides to PC software of various kinds. To better sell the books, he looked to online outlets, which in the early 1990s were few and far between. I dare say there were none. This led to the development in 1993 of the first commercial website, Global Network Navigator, which was sold to AOL in 1995. With the development of the Hacks series of books about hacking computers, Dougherty recognized that computer hackers were not just thinking about hacking computers, but how to hack lots of other things. They were developing a culture in which they sought to deconstruct, reverse engineer the world around them to reuse the components in new and creative ways. Dougherty recognized that we are all hackers in a sense, but more generally, makers. And he recognizes that the realization of ourselves as makers can revolutionize how we engage with the world around us. The Maker Revolution has exploded since Make Magazine was first published in 2005, and there are more than 1,000 maker spaces around the world, places where people can get together to learn how to use tools to express their creativity and make stuff. And they are, all over the world. Beirut, Lebanon, China, Japan, Cuba. And people are making everything from clothes to cars, from drones to musical instruments, and using every tool available, from homebrew foundries to miniature open-source digital controllers, learning as they go. There are a number of maker spaces, of course, in the Delaware Valley, and annual Maker Fairs are sprouting up everywhere people feel the spark of creativity. Please give a warm welcome to the person who can help us realize we all are makers, Dale Dougherty.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone, and it really is a pleasure to be here tonight. I want to offer, those of you that are standing in the back, there's plenty of seats up here. You won't disturb us to walk down and take a seat. I'd rather you be comfortable for the evening. I've been here today exploring, talking to people, about could Philadelphia support a Maker Faire? Is there a way to organize it? And, just seeing what you had in the lobby up there, seeing the turnout here, tells me you really have kind of a core that allows you to, I think, create a Maker Faire here. The only thing we'd add is a bunch of kids, running around, enjoying this, seeing their minds just go, wow, I didn't know this world existed. I'm particularly happy to be at the Franklin Institute, and as I'll tell you more in a moment, but I think there's such a degree of history here, and as you might see in my book, I kind of want to connect the maker movement to our history, American history, and really our human culture. This is, while in some ways it's a new thing, we might talk about makers and a new thing, making is not new, it's something we've always done. And I'm reminded, my parents were born in Carbondale and 44th, which is up near Scranton, and my grandfather was a coal miner. And I'm not that far removed from people who made their living, working physically demanding jobs. That's not quite the world of making we're talking about today, but I feel important to recognize the connection to the things, even the cultural artifacts that we produced in our history. But speaking of history, particularly fond to be in the home of Ben Franklin, and therefore I'm really subtitling the talk tonight as how do we make more Franklins? And, but it's not just about the Benjamins, okay? It's not just about how much money we can make in startups or other things. How do we create a culture, a collaborative culture of sharing that invites the next generation and really everybody around the world to create and make and discover who they are? That to me, if we can initiate that condition, we don't know where that takes us, where that leads. As Dr. Pitts described, I began using the word makers, not fully understanding the power of it. In about 2005, I'm creating a magazine called Make, and I'm just going to call our readers makers. And it was almost that kind of simple thing, not understanding. But it turned out that was sort of like a free word that could be stretched and pulled. And people still ask me today, how do you define maker? And I go, I don't define maker. How would you define maker? Because I want you to define it in a way that includes you, that invites what you do, what you like, the processes you use, the tools you use, the places you meet to do this. Define it in ways that you're a maker. But it has really taken off for some reason, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But I saw the opportunity around the magazine when I created it to kind of reinvent what popular mechanics was in the 20th century, but to look at digital technology. And there were all these what I call popular magazines: popular science, popular mechanics, popular electronics. And they really created a culture of tinkering and a culture of kind of reading under the covers at night. How does that work? And a culture of kits. These things, I think, were really marginalized by consumer culture. We know my belief is that actually popular electronics is a magazine that Bill Gates finds on the Harvard newsstand and leaves Harvard to go to Albuquerque, New Mexico to work on a computer company and write CPM, or write for Altair, right? It's a magazine that tells him there's a personal computer revolution coming, and he decides, heck with school, I'm going to go be part of that revolution. And I think in some ways, this kind of story today is there's a lot of this happening here. How do we connect lots of people to it? And it wasn't about talking, like Wired talks to you about technology and the smart people that do things. I wanted to show you how things work, how you can learn how to do them. It was like a cooking magazine, but it wasn't about cooking. It was about digital products or microcontrollers or drones or anything. How do you build them and use them? But I think a fundamental insight I had from the beginning was that makers weren't serious. They were playing. They were having fun doing this. They wanted to know how technology works, so they took it apart. And I actually saw that out of this kind of spirit of play, or in this context of play, that's where innovation really comes from. Is when you're kind of take the guard down, you're not necessarily so intentional about what you're trying to do. You're trying to immerse yourself in something, see problems, see situations, and see what you can do. And it's almost this engagement around, well, what does the technology allow me to do? And then what can I do with it? That is sort of the dance around that I wanted to get involved with. And then meeting all these makers, I started Maker Faire in 2006. And it was really just a simple idea, just like a science fair, a art fair, a county fair, is bring your stuff and talk about it, show and tell. We do it in kindergarten, but we stopped doing it for some reason. But the idea was not so much just the show and tell, but like up there, would you know before you came tonight that you had a dozen or so really cool projects going on in your community by people just like you, people that have put a lot of effort into figuring out some idea and developing it. And I thought if we did these maker fairs, that this was a way to encourage other people to see themselves as makers. And in some ways, I am trying to, without sort of kicking in the face, provide an alternative to consumer culture, an alternative to just buying things to make ourselves happy. What if we enjoy making things and the learning that goes with that and the exploration, the curiosity and discovery? That's really what I wanted to celebrate at a Maker Faire. So my colleague Sabrina is in the audience, and Sabrina Merlo, and she's really helped us over the last 7 or 8 years build up a network of Maker Fairs around the world. We have over 220-some Maker Fairs this year in 40, you said today 48 countries. It's sort of growing all the time. And it tells me, even, again, just echoing back, this is something in all of us, regardless of nationality or culture or ethnicity or religion. It's something that resonates with lots of people. And we're trying to kind of figure that out. But, I think one of the key ideas that I had, which I expressed in a TED Talk once, is I knew, I could say, to be honest, the number of makers in the world is pretty small. I could be content with that and say, okay, I've got a magazine audience and I got, some number of thousands of people that come to a Maker Faire. That's it. The number of makers, I've reached everybody. But I kind of thought that's not really true, that people don't know that they're makers. And so I find myself echoing this statement, that it's in all of us. We don't all choose to develop it. We are not always given the context. But think if you were an athlete and no one asked you to play ball, or no one had a gym or a ball field, or there weren't coaches or leagues or training, would you really know that you had athletic ability? You certainly wouldn't have the opportunity to develop it. And I think this is kind of where I feel like this has gone MIA in our culture. And so it used to be in garages. It used to be in some homes anyway. But I wanted to try to bring that back. So this summer I've been in China for about 3 weeks. This is Singapore. And it's wonderful just to see people organize around creating spaces, creating programs. The sign behind them says purposeful makers. They're not just going to be playful, they're going to be purposeful. But great people, and they've really been at this for years and growing this. This is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where we did some training this summer and kind of did a test run for a Maker Faire. And, we had really hard conditions there. We had to train young women and young men in separate rooms. We had to have they were veiled and lots of challenges. But underneath all of that, and despite all those challenges, they wanted to express themselves creatively. They wanted to engage, learn these tools, and do things that they had never been given the opportunity to do. This is Xi'an in China. And if you mentioned the terracotta warrior, so our Makey robot is dressed as a terracotta warrior on both sides there. And it's the city where the terracotta warriors are found. We had this fascinating talk by a man who collects old tools. And he had this hoe. The terracotta warriors were discovered in 1972 by a farmer digging a well. That's how old they are. They're 2,000 years old, but they were covered and buried. And a guy with a hoe was out there digging a hole, and he comes across this, really, it's like 2 aircraft hangars worth of buried soldiers and horses and all these things. But, it still can relate back to almost an individual doing that. I was in Moscow recently. This sign's cut off a little bit at the bottom. It says, "I'm a maker" in Russian, right? So to hear people express this and to kind of define a new context for that. In Russia, I visited the Cosmonautics Museum there, which is fascinating to see many of the great achievements. The Russians were the first to put a satellite in space, not only the first man, but the first woman in space as well, and continue to do incredible things. And I read someone said I wasn't a communist until they put Yuri Gagarin in space. It finally made him believe that the communists could achieve something. But Makers, what I enjoy seeing out in the hallway are the projects they create and the people behind them. And let me tell you the story of one of them that I met. This is Damon McMillan. He has a mechanical engineering background, but he had the idea that on his own, on the side, he wanted to build a boat. Now, you can see how he started to map it out on a chalkboard. He starts to list the parts. He draws what it is. He wants it to be a solar-powered boat, and he wants it to be autonomous. It doesn't have a person, no pilot. It's going to go on its own. So he builds a prototype and puts it out in a local pond and takes a picture of it. And he's kind of figured out where to house the electronics and how to put the solar panels on. But as you see, there's no person on it. He said, this is what I think defines him as a maker. I built the sea charger in my garage, not for money or competition, but simply as a challenge. He had an idea, and he wanted to see if he could realize that idea and if he could make it real. And that's the beauty. That's how it initiates. He said what started as a year-long project turned into 30 months of mistakes. Makers are terrible at estimating time, I will tell you. But it consisted of mistakes and compromises and do-overs. He's just honest, It didn't turn out the way he thought. He had to work at it and revise it and change. I think it's just honest. That's the way it happens. It takes longer and it's more complicated than we ever thought. But, he creates models of it. The thing that he told me was that he used really common standard components, and that's sort of the secret of the maker movement. These things are available widely to you. He said if he used professional-grade components, he might risk his marriage by spending too much money. So he kept it cheap. And last year at Maker Faire, he brought his sea charger boat and displayed it in San Francisco. And he talks about how people came up and some people said, that'll never work. And he said, what do you mean it won't work? And they explained why. And he said, well, I'm going to show you. And a week later, he goes to Half Moon Bay, which is on the California coast, and he set the sea charger in the water on course for Hawaii. This little 8-foot boat that can't see whales or container ships or anything else. And it has inside a modem that'll talk to a satellite. Every couple hours, it'll say, here's where I am, and give it its location. So he goes home, opens his computer, sits there and watches it progress. The wind is pretty high, and it blows it down towards Southern California. He wonders if it's ever going to start tracking the way he wants it. But it does. And it goes for a couple days more. Then he loses communication. It's kind of like, space. It's just like the space satellites, right? And he doesn't hear for a couple of days. And then magically, for God knows why, it's back online and he's able to track it. But here's the magic moment. 41 days after launch, he's standing on the shore of the Big Island with his wife and parents and brother, and he catches a glimpse of his boat coming into the big island in Hawaii. So this idea that started on a chalkboard that was just kind of a crazy, weekend project, he actually achieved something that someone hasn't done yet, right? And here he is with his family, and he's kind of sheepishly proud there, in the picture. But, inside him, something's like, I did it. I made it happen. And that satisfaction, that adventure is so much a part of this. But, in many ways, it doesn't end here for reasons. He's a maker. He looks at the boat and he says, I got to put that in a crate and send it back to California. That's going to cost me money. So what does he do? He puts it back in the water and he programs it for New Zealand. New Zealand. California. Anyway, so it goes 155 days at sea, and then the rudder stopped responding. But it had traveled 6,480 miles, nautical miles, far beyond what he imagined design. And anybody at Maker Faire had told him it wouldn't work was clearly wrong. But it doesn't really end there because he has a mother. He tells his mother that he lost his boat. And this is actually sounds like a little boy talking to his mother. But she says, have you ever thought of calling up the container ship companies that travel between New Zealand and Hawaii to see if they'll find it for you? And he said, no. And she said, well, I'll do that for you. And by God, we have lost planes, 747s in this area. right? And haven't found them. But by God, he writes and says, well, actually, I should add, I'll go back to this. Incidentally, he said, just yesterday, the boat was picked up by a container ship on the way to New Zealand. Someone found it and said, what the heck is this? And they put it on there. We had him write this story up, in Make Magazine, the little boat that could, because it was just such a fascinating, I wanted to hear all that he thought about what he was doing, not just the recipe or what was involved, but his own, story. It's a great story, right? And, this... where am I? His boat today is in the New Zealand Maritime Museum on display. So it goes from this garage all the way to New Zealand in the museum. It doesn't really matter how you got there, does it? You're there. So what an adventure. What a real thing to see your idea develop and take on really a life of its own. I think, the maker movement, that I write about in the book, is really changing how we make things, where we make things. We visited Next Fab today. These facilities they didn't exist 10 years ago. You can go in as a member to maker spaces, have access to tools, and even make things that we couldn't dream of making long ago. But the thing that I'm most proud about, and you could see it in that group up there, it's changing who gets to make it. You and I, ordinary people, young kids, can learn these tools. Evan made a really nice comment today. He's a PhD from Cornell, and he kind of realized working with kids that they didn't actually have to have all his education to be able to do what he was doing today. That we can unlock this for a lot of people that maybe, would never have had the opportunity. I think the makers share a tool set, a skill set, and a mindset. And I think the mindset is really what I try to talk about in the book a lot more, because that's the magic. That, we can teach anybody skills and tools, but when you start to really own this and think that you can create things, you have ideas that can be made real, that you look at the world differently, you look at each other differently. And that, I think, is not a mindset we develop easily in school. And to some degree, I think the maker movement is finding its own place to develop that skill. Marshall McLuhan wrote that we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. When something like 3D printers come out, which makers really didn't invent 3D printing, but they made the 3D printers accessible to ordinary people by lowering the price and making kits initially to do them. But, we begin to think of what's possible to build with a 3D printer. You see it in their exhibit here. And kids are really free. If someone asked me what to make with a 3D printer, I'd find some object in the world and say, well, can we make this? Well, kids will start thinking of things they've never seen in the real world, and like nested structures inside of nested structures inside of nested structures, things you could not build any other way but a 3D printer. And that's what they begin to design. But this mindset, I think, is terribly important to pass on or infect, or whatever word you want to use, with kids today. It's first of all a sense of agency, that you can do things, that it's up to you to do that. I think making is engaging. It's the magic of this is that you put kids in a room with some tools and materials. They want to do this. This is, I'm sorry, not like STEM. I don't have to convince them to take the castor oil. They actually think this is sweet and they want to drink it. And because this nature of being playful, this is the thing that I hope those of you that are educators and have really respect about making is to keep the playful side alive. It frees us to experiment and try things without judging us. Most of us are creative. The only reason we're not creative is because we judge ourselves too harshly. Like, that's no good. That idea is not worth acting on. If you play with that idea rather than censor it, you allow it to grow and develop and take you places, just like that boat. I think being resourceful, resilient, learning to work within constraints, learning to overcome frustration, like the boat project. It doesn't always work out the way you think, and it's harder than you think. Ben Franklin said this. My son is named Ben, and he actually, when he graduated from high school, sent me this quote, and I've never actually used that talk, but Franklin says, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn." My son hated school. but he was a doer. If he could see someone do something, he could repeat that and imitate it and learn to do it immediately. And I think we have lost the power of engagement in school, particularly for a lot of kids. And they're never going to learn science and technology unless we engage them, unless we involve them, unless we sort of connect to their own motivations and show them. Mrs. Quinnett and I are right about him. He's about a 12-year-old kid, shows up at Maker Faire. His mom got it in the magazine because he was starting to show boredom in middle school and kind of backing out. He came, and he not only sort of one year came, and next year he came back with something he had made, and then he built a website, and he and his mom make kits, and they ship them from the kitchen table at home. He's also kind of famous for having built a product that only a 13-year-old boy would necessarily want to have. It was a fart sensor. Sharing, really is what makes the maker community what it is today. It's kind of something you take for granted sometimes. There's a lot of oversharing that happens on social media. But, our ability to share our knowledge, share our projects, share our practice is really something that certainly happens in spaces like a maker space or a fab lab, but it also happens globally and connects makers. We just launched a new site called Maker Share this summer to invite makers to share their projects. I would love to see each one of those projects that were out in the Franklin Institute tonight posted on there to really tell the story about your project. My frustration when I visit maker spaces is I see really great stuff like you see tonight, but nobody knows about it. And I see great stuff at Maker Faire, but unless you were at Maker Faire, you wouldn't see that. So we wanted to build a site where people start sharing their projects, tell the story about their projects, and ultimately build a portfolio of themselves as a maker. MIT is now accepting a maker portfolio as a supplement to admissions. So you can tell them about what you do and who you are as a maker. And I think we see that in the art and design world, but we don't see it like in the STEM world. And I think that's going to change because I think they want to see what your aptitudes and interests are and how have you acted on that. This is Hannah, who's in that previous slide. This is kind of what sort of impresses me. Hannah came up to me at a talk I gave at a high school, and she's about 14 or 15. She's a graphic design interest, but she wanted to show me that she had built a 3D printed spirometer. Now, other than Dr. Basil Harris, I don't think the rest of us know what a spirometer is. I didn't, and I had asked her, what is it? And she said, well, it's something you breathe into to measure your intake and outtake. And I said, well, why did you build one? She said, well, I have asthma. And I go to the doctor's office, and they have a really fancy spirometer there that I breathe into. But I don't have asthma attacks in the doctor's office. I have it when I'm riding my horse or I'm out running around doing things. And so she decided she wanted to build one. And here's her 3D printed, spirometer. And it communicates with her cell phone. She gets the readings for it. And, I don't know how complicated it is. It's not terribly. There's probably others, but she could not find one that was affordable for her, so she built one. And there's got to be other people like her that have that. And what we kind of see is sometimes these become products and sometimes these become communities. You see this in prosthetics, people creating 3D printed hands. You don't really so much buy a 3D printed hand as you join a community. You find a design, you modify it, maybe you contribute back to that community. So there's a lot of different ways that the maker community is doing things that have value here. Here is her project and some of the documentation for it. So the last thing I kind of want to just touch on is Walter Isaacson wrote an article talking about Franklin. And he said, we kind of have two types in America. One is sort of these sort of proponents of individual liberty and just, it's kind of the individual hero. And we see that a lot in the tech world, the entrepreneur as hero. But he said Franklin represents a much more civic-minded view of America, that You contribute back to the community that you're a part of. And he said that Franklin believed that the business of America was not merely to celebrate success, but to also ensure that each new generation had the opportunity to achieve it. And I think that's our real challenge, Dave. It's like we could have, we do have an economy where some people have enormous success. The question is, can we share that success with a lot more people? And I think the maker movement, is at least a prototype on how we might do that in the future. I'd encourage you to join, get involved. I hope most of you see yourselves as makers. But there are a lot of people out there that aren't here, that don't know about this. Take this out to them and talk to them about it. Empower people to explore, innovate, and create value. It's something they can do. And even if it's just to make their own life or their own community better, for any reason, that's a good thing. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, very inspiring. So folks, we'll ask you to submit your questions. Again, I'm going to ask if we have, do we have some slides? Am I mistaken that we have slides that tell people where? Oh, you have cards that tell you where to submit your questions. Please do. We'll receive them here, and we'll try to get them all asked. So to get started, I have a couple of questions for you, Dale. I think the first one I wanted to ask you is, that comes to me just now, is listening to you talk and thinking about what you've done over time. You've been the author of a number of books. You've been a hacker of sorts through the computer age. You've been in publishing, and you find yourself now as the founder of the Maker movement. How do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a maker, an inventor, a publisher, an evangelist, or do all of these things mixed together?
I kind of see myself as a preacher.
Okay.
I think behind that is trying to build the community has really kind of been. I think from the early years of internet and open source and the web, the lessons really were understanding technical communities, the people in them, and listening to them, what they were interested in, and trusting that, and learning to work with that. So I think particularly the maker community, I thought it was one that needed, well, first of all, I started Maker Fairs where I'd see all these kids running around and say, I've got to really think about these kids that show up at Maker Faire, and they're so excited, and they want to know, how did they get involved? And there often weren't good answers. There were places for adults to go, but not for kids. Schools didn't have this. Yeah. And so, I really see myself as sort of trying to just spread the word, because when I talk to people that know nothing about this, it seems to resonate with them and mean something to them, and they figure out their own way to do it. I mean, I don't need to talk about technology or train them in that way, but I think the idea is new to a lot of people still.
Mm-hmm. So sort of following along on that, we were talking a little bit earlier about all the great projects that we've seen here this evening, and I was thinking about the fact that there's probably a rich community in the Philadelphia area of people who do things, but maybe we don't see them as much as we should, as you're describing, having a place where people can put their projects. But it also dawned on me that there are probably many, many, many more people who have great ideas that simply wouldn't get expressed if there wasn't a space for them to express those ideas. Yeah. And so are you thinking that this is one of the things that something like this helps to have happen, for people to realize that they can express these ideas?
Well, I think, first of all, you kind of have to be able to, or you have to kind of learn to act on your own idea. You can't just go give someone else your idea.
Right.
Nobody wants that. They want you to work it. And so I think people are sort of used to dismissing their ideas sometimes, and how do we get them to take it seriously, to act on it and do something? And I think that's the creative urge, is not the final form. It's actually that initial kind of silly belief that I'm going to do something with it. I'm going to act on this. I'm not going to put it away, but I'm going to take it as far as I can. And some ideas don't work out, and some work out in unexpected ways.
Can you imagine? I mean, do you think about the idea? Do you think about the concept that there are so many incredible ideas just waiting to sort of show up?
Yeah, and I think this is why, when I talk to makers, I kind of want to know more about them and learn about them, and there's sort of patterns that you're looking for, and I wonder what turned them on, what got them confident in doing this. But that's why I kind of think with particularly with kids, and and I mean any age really. Think of the talent we lose because they don't believe that they have the ability or the idea to do this kind of stuff. That and one of the things I'll say about those things, think about how many of those. I'm thinking of the bed. Kind of the timer that encourages you to turn a patient over.
Oh yes, the owl timer.
Right, the owl timer. There was another one up there. Was for a particular disease in the armpits. I guess that a bandage for that. These are really narrow problems if you think about it. But I think the Maker is allowing people to solve problems that weren't, in some ways weren't worth solving by either a company or by government.
Yes, right.
And so problems that only maybe have one constituent are possible to be explored today. And that's kind of interesting. Because what the lessons we have is usually when you solve for one, if you do it the right way, other people learn about it, and there's multiple cases of that, more than you think.
Right. Right. So now, when you were growing up, though, you said you grew up in Carbondale?
No, my parents moved eventually to California and then back to Kentucky, and so I kind of lived in different places. But are you going to ask me?
I'm curious to find out if your house when you were growing up was a place of just a large pile of, and somewhere in your house was a large pile of objects all taken apart, not reassembled.
Yeah. No, honestly, I don't think it was. It was more probably a consumer household. My dad didn't know how to do a whole lot, and so I didn't learn a lot from him. But I always had a fascination with things like recorders, reel-to-reel tapes, and other equipment like that, and fooling around, and the early computers, the TI-99 and other things were always pretty interesting to me.
Okay, so folks, you can see up on the screen here now, if you have a question, you can tweet to the hashtag TalkFI, or you can email to speakerseries@fi.edu, and we'll be looking for your questions here. So, how far, Dale, do you think? Well, let's do it this way. This is an incredible movement that can spark a tremendous amount of creativity in people all over the world. When you think about long-term effect of this or the reach of this, what comes to your mind in a vision of how far something like this can go?
It's a good question. I find it hard sometimes to think really out that, because in many ways what we're doing is already out where most people are. But I don't, when you look at things like what was the impact of the personal computer or the mobile phone on our lives? That these are empowering technologies which we use. They're more powerful, more complex and sophisticated. None of us took a course in using a cell phone, but we use it for all kinds of things to manage our lives. And I think that really is this sort of force of democratizing technology, that what happens when it gets in the hands of a lot of different people that sometimes have been really excluded from participating in things like innovation, and what happens when these creative tools can be used by almost anybody for any purpose. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing that I've been thinking about, and it's almost not, but in many ways, I sort of started in the, with like one of the first books O'Reilly published that I did was on the internet, and here's this amazing technology. We can communicate, we can connect, and when I did GNN, just showing people, look, this web page just came from across the world. It's not on my computer. It was wow. And of course, today that's taken for granted. You have all that connectivity.
Yeah.
But we had such hope for sort of creating an open world that was in some ways open source. But you also see this technology being used for surveillance, for a lot of negative things. Being in China, you can't pass a street corner without seeing lots of cameras that are flashing, and you kind of have this feeling, on the negative side, that your every movement is tracked one way or another. I don't know, how much to worry about that, but I feel like we have to. I guess what I'm interested in, these are also tools of freedom, and we don't want to lose that capability in them. Our own freedom to express ourselves, our own freedom to communicate. My kind of hope is that, cultures like China want the benefits of technology sometimes without opening up their culture. And I think creativity and openness come from an open culture. And I think it is America's strength. It isn't necessarily our schools as much as our culture clashes because a lot of different things, rub up against each other, and we're always having to think about that, and it's not homogenous, Right. And I think if you encourage, say, different people in the world to really take creativity seriously and take these as tools of expression, it may be a way out of that world where they're closely monitored or controlled.
Interesting. You said you did spend some time in China.
Yeah.
And how did it look so far?
Well, we have about 5 Maker Fairs in China. I visited like 4 of them in different cities. It's a fascinating country, and I really like it. The people, the food,
of course.
But their ability to make things is incredible. The Shenzhen factories and their way of thinking about things is the challenge. Here's a really interesting distinction: China and Japan. If I had to choose a Maker Faire that I think is like the most interesting one to go to, I would choose Tokyo. The Japanese makers are the most creative, interesting. They do the most complex things that sometimes just miniaturization of something, or they're playful. All their robots wear costumes. They're all characters.
Okay.
They sumo robots. They're very playful, but very serious about it. These are often grown men that just look like this is so serious. But very few of those Japanese makers are entrepreneurial. They don't take that idea seriously enough to turn it into a business. And in Japan, you kind of have these very big companies that are responsible for most of the economy that aren't innovating terribly well. And at the grassroots level, you have all this innovation, and it's just completely disconnected.
Wow.
In China, in China, you don't have that sort of. They are still in many ways a developing country, and they have not had what Japan has enjoyed in sort of a prosperity and culture. And so they tend to copy ideas. You see a group of drones at Maker Faire, and you say, "Oh, what does your drone do?" And it's like, "It's a drone." And you go to the next guy, and you say, "What's your drone? How's it different than his drone?" It's not. It's just like his drone. And they tend to look in the market and say, drones are popular, so I'm going to make one of those, and I can take exactly that. And I think the knack in somewhat creatively is finding things that don't exist in the market and making them. And that's what's sort of different. But I will say that I really believe China will overcome that problem. There's just such tremendous energy and an industry there that I think they will try to, eventually catch up and exceed probably all of us.
And a little bit later, I want to ask you a question about that's related to that, but talks about community in the sense of how this is an interesting community within itself through social media that has the connections through the digital technology. But we have questions from the audience, and I want to get to those. So here's one about schools, Dale. The question is, how would you suggest we maximize our maker space time in a school setting where kids are only allowed 2 or 3 periods a week?
Yeah. It's a tough question. I mean, 2 or 3 periods a week is better than none. So I mean, kind of comparatively. But what I'm kind of seeing is makerspaces, as I imagine when you started promoting them into schools, was just a way in the door. It's a Trojan horse in a way. To create a different kind of space so it didn't look like a classroom. They didn't have desks and chalkboards. Instead, they had tools and materials, and kids were going, oh, what do I get to do in here? That's exactly the question, right? And I think in the best places, the maker spaces, are beginning to kind of transform how the school works. Not just we're going to put the kids there for a couple hours a day or a week, but we're going to start rethinking how we have more projects for students to do, more engaging work for them to do, and it isn't we're all doing the same thing at the same time in the same way, right? It's more open-ended. So I think it's a way to get into schools, and the thing that's made me happiest is that teachers have led this by bringing in themselves. They're figuring this out. A teacher in St. Louis said to me, I started with a closet. And the next year, I got a room and a closet. Next year, I got a budget and a room and a closet. And it's some of just by proving this, people see, well, guys, the kids are really engaged. They're happy. They're working, and look what they're doing. You can't help see that. The thing I'm interested in schools is not necessarily how do we get more kids to MIT, but how do we serve the kids that are bored to death in school? How do we, which is a lot more than the kids that are going to MIT.
Don't we just give them some power tools and let them go at it?
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of, you mentioned shop class. I think that was an outlet for a lot of people that did not understand or did not particularly fit into the academic track. Yeah. Today, if you don't fit in the academic track, you have few options. And it could be you have learning issues, learning challenges. But there's just no real good option for you.
And that's a tremendous waste of talent.
It is. And you create people that are angry at the world, right? Because they don't fit in and they think they're a failure.
Then we shouldn't give them power tools, you're saying.
No,
okay.
But they will find them. But yeah, I think it is about realizing that people certainly learn differently. They have different goals, but it isn't. I worry sometimes that we're using technology in the wrong way in schools a lot of times to just sort of replicate what's in a textbook and put it on an iPad instead of really engaging kids. And this, part of this comes, my belief in this sort of learn by doing, which is a 100-year-old philosophy from John Dewey and expressed by Montessori and all these other thinkers that's just been forgotten in American education and mostly around the world. But when you go talk to engineers and scientists and you ask, how did you get into this? How did you think about it? They don't say, well, I had an 8th grade class that was just awesome, I mean, once in a while they'll talk about a teacher, but often they'll say, I was interested in bugs, and I just wanted to learn everything about bugs and insects and all that kind of stuff. And they sort of interacted with the world in some original way that they wanted to do more of it. And it kind of led them in school to kind of figure out how to make a life out of that. But, it was taking things apart. It was doing those things, and so I think it's actually engaging with the world in meaningful ways. That learning about it, experimenting. I mean, that's kind of the idea of science. Isn't here's the textbook. That's the problem I have with a lot of STEM education. It's just doubling down on lecture and textbook instead of how do we know these things? We know them by experimenting, by learning to test ideas. Don't just trust them.
Right.
I've kind of said this in the past, but we teach science like we teach religion. You have to believe in what's in the book. Yeah. That sounds wrong. Yeah. It's a fundamentally different way of experiencing life.
Yeah. So how about other spaces in the community, though, Dale? Can other spaces other than schools be places where this can take place? I mean, someone in the audience is asking about libraries.
Yes.
As a potential.
Libraries have been the champions of maker spaces, and to my delight, school librarians, school librarians public libraries. I once went to American Library Association to give a talk, and you got 300 people in there, and I thought, oh my God, they're going to jump on me, But no, they didn't want me to justify the maker movement. They just want to know how to get started, and this actually is something that resonates with me. My love of making actually sort of comes from books. Making a magazine, making, writing a book. It's like I love those how-to books that I could find in the library to show you how to do something. If my dad couldn't help me, I could read about it. And still, even as an adult, how do you make cheese, or how do you make, hot sauce, or find an article online, or find a book, and learning on your own is what a library kind of represents. And the librarian always is a really great person, and then never gave you the answer. Right? Think about anybody else that withholds the answer and instead points you somewhere else to figure it out for yourself. And it is a temple of self-directed learning. And I think that's the mindset that I think most of us need to really thrive in the 21st century.
I discovered this one a little bit later as I was growing up. My father was a radar technician for the U.S. Navy. And he worked at a place just outside of Philadelphia that's now called Warminster. It was a Naval Air Development Center. And his job was to repair radar equipment. That's what he did. The interesting thing was that my father was, if you met my father, you would think that he was a farmer from Georgia. You'd never know that he had this incredible electronic capability. He had this very, very high skill level. And I sort of remember that my father could fix anything, people like this. A hairpin is all they need, a little tiny screwdriver. They can fix anything, right? And so my father would fix stereo systems, he would fix computer systems and things like that. And I would wonder how he knew this, because, as I said, if you met him, you'd think he was a farmer from Georgia. He had the accent, he had the walk, he had the demeanor. You never would realize he had this technical capability, but he had this other really great strength. And it was that if he needed to know how to fix something, he knew how to read a schematic. So what he did was he went to the main branch of the free library, got the schematic for the thing, read the schematic, and fixed it that way. But he would never tell you that's what he did. It's just that you thought he knew how to do this.
It's a magician giving up his secrets.
Exactly, right. Yeah. But libraries, right, of course, certainly can play a critical role.
But I think we need, I think this is what has changed a bit. We used to kind of think that we needed one, fab lab in a city, or, people, but we actually need lots of spaces, and they have different purposes. They're organized differently. Some may be for just adults, some may be just for kids, some may have real basic equipment, some may have, that was the biggest water jet I've ever seen that's in NextFab up there. But it's, networking these spaces, I think, is kind of the next challenge. What are the relationships, like if we're training people how to do that? I'll say this because Marvin brought this up. I think one of the things we need in the maker movement are more coaches. If you think about sports, it's coaches. I think of making as a practice, and a coach is there to guide practice, to make it, fairly efficient, to give you feedback, and hopefully improve your performance ultimately. And many of you who are makers out there, I'd say that whether you do it informally or formally, the role of coaching, and I think we'll probably actually get to be a market for it someday, but to just informally coach someone, and not so much on how to use an Arduino. That's kind of easy, you can pick that up. It's how to develop an idea, how to, that kind of thing that a human does. It says, good idea, keep working on it. You don't need a lot of technical knowledge to say that. So any of you can do that, but it's just support, it's just listening and encouragement. That's what's needed in a lot of cases. It's just something we all as humans know how to do.
Well, sort of along those lines, but sort of shifting gears instead, though, is where do product developers and designers of software fit into the maker movement? It seems that there's lots of physical solutions to things, building physical solutions to things, but where do product developers and designers, software designers
I
fit
think,
in here?
you mentioned the hacking idea, and this is sort of the idea I had around starting Make, really was that the physical and the digital worlds were connecting together, and that you wouldn't just write a program on a computer. You could, and compile it, and it runs there and does something. But computers could be used to connect to things in the real world, whether sensors, or just think of the owl timer up there. Yeah. It's not just a clock with counting down 2 hours. It's actually publishing that data wirelessly to a website, so a caretaker at home could look at that data, that a nurse could look at that data.
Sure.
So a lot of the maker things are some of these projects are really generating rich data, and like Dr. Harris's tricorder thing, he's collecting all the data from the human, but
great.
Just putting data back to the a person isn't going to help them. You have to interpret it for them. You have to do something with it. So it's I think AI is increasingly going to be part of the Maker toolkit of things that we're going to take that, we're going to collect interesting data. But I'll just give you an example of where something I thought was really interesting in that most cities measure air quality by having a government station that has a sensor up there.
Right.
Sometimes that sensor is politically located away from where the pollution is. Right?
Yeah.
Because readings might be too high. The Maker movement starts creating air quality sensors that can be made, by school children. And instead of one in a city, you could have thousands of them.
Yeah.
And that school, unlike weather data, which you can't do too much about the sun or the rain or anything, you might be able to do something politically to say this school should not be located next to a highway because we have data now that shows what the pollution levels are, right? And we could compare it to the wealthier schools in the suburbs that are conveniently located far from the subway, the highways.
Right.
So, data can be really powerful, and we have new ways of collecting it. So, again, whether you are a maker of those devices or deploying them or really making sense of that data and acting on that. I think this is all part of this movement.
So we're coming down to the end of our time, and I have the one question I'd like to ask you. I'm not sure quite how to phrase it because you see so much, and as you said earlier, it's sometimes difficult for you to project out into the future what you see, what you can sort of envision for this. But for you, is there some particular interest or avenue down which you would like to see creativity? Is there something that you dream of in your mind that you think could come out of this? To be far out on the edge, somebody like me would say, I hope somebody can come up with the technology to actually produce a real-time transporter, something crazy like that. But save that, is there something that you have?
I just keep coming back. It is so satisfying to meet people, have developed an idea and made something real. Just like the people up there, like Yasmin and her roar thing. Where's Yasmin? Back there. And just to think how much work, how much effort, and what an accomplishment that is when I see that, I say, we can make more Yasmins, just like more Franklins, right? It's possible if some people can figure this out. More of us. So, what kind of world does that enable, right? And I believe, on a personal level, it can be a world that we're much more engaged in creating, rather than a world that, when I look at sort of the political landscape nationally, where people, I think, I don't know. Particularly this last year, has just been, as a creative person, it's kind of been the opposite feeling, right? That our culture is kind of destructive, almost imploding sometimes. We're losing touch with each other in ways, and so I think this basic, almost. This is a task we undertake ourselves to make ourselves better, but also to enable us to contribute more to our community and to be more connected to each other. So that's the idea of a maker city and other things is that we can use this to change the things we can change, the things that are in our control. We may not be able to change the president or other aspects of the world, but we can actually find people in our community who share similar interests, passion, and will work with us to empower us to do things.
That would be great. Hopefully somebody will create a voter bot that we can use to change the president at some point. Folks, can we have a great round of applause for Dale Dougherty?
Thank you.
Dale, thank you very much. It was
Thank you very much.
fantastic.
Appreciate
It's
it.
really great. Such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you all.